Dear friends and colleagues, welcome to yet another FIIA climate briefing. I'm Antto Vihma from FIIA and I have the honor and privilege to chair this morning's session. Baku climate meeting, so COP29, concluded on the weekend after intensive negotiations on Saturday evening. And we are here to admire and criticize the outcomes of that meeting. A lot of analysis is now popping up everywhere from think tanks and research institutes and NGOs. And today we have two prominent experts to pick up the task here in the webinar. Postdoctoral fellow Karolina Hurri from FIIA and associate professor Julia Jamineva from University of Eastern Finland. They were both present in the plenary halls and in the corridors of the Baku meeting on the second week, so they can give us the authentic and credible experience from the actual negotiations. So that's very exciting. We're going to hear about the key outcomes of different agenda items and perhaps also on the current state of the UNFCCC climate negotiations as well, as there's been a lot of talks about the role of the presidency and the actual organization of the negotiation process. The first cut is by Karolina, then directly followed by Julia, and then we have some time for discussion and quick questions, hopefully. Without further ado, Karolina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning on my behalf as well. I'm just gonna share my screen. Is it on the presentation mode? Yes, okay, good. So this morning in my presentation, I will focus on the presidency's leadership, then talk something about the criticism of the COPs in general, and then also discuss the roles of US and China. And with Julia, we cannot cover all the outcomes in this 1 hour webinar, but I will say something about the lack of progress in mitigation, and then Julia will discuss some of the key outcomes in more detail in her presentation. So for a number of reasons, it was expected that COP29 would not be an easy conference, although I'm not sure whether any COP is easy nowadays. We have witnessed another year of political and economic instability and conflicts, while simultaneously multipolarization of the world changes power relations also within the UNFCCC. To make matters more difficult for global climate action, President Trump got re-elected less than a week before the start of this COP. Also, the trust between the so-called North and South has been eroding due to insufficient climate action, also by uncertainty and challenges related to climate finance, but also due to non-UNFCCC related issues, such as the unequal global distribution of COVID vaccines. On top of this, the agenda of COP29 included two, I would say, most difficult questions in the climate negotiations: finance and fossil fuels. So with these challenging starting points, the expectations of progress at COP29, at least for me, were extremely low. The Azerbaijani presidency received plenty of criticism for a lack of leadership during the conference, and I thought I would discuss this criticism with the help of typology of climate leadership, which has been widely applied in the climate leadership literature. So according to this typology, state can show leadership via 4 different modes. The first one being directional, meaning that a state can lead by example, taking unilateral action, for example, establishing a carbon trading scheme or reducing emissions significantly. The second mode is ideational, which means the ability to set an agenda on the international level. and influence others' perceptions or provide these framings for the problems for others to then agree on. The third mode, which could be seen the most important one for COP presidency, is the capability, the diplomatic skills to find these consensus, bring people together. Then following finally the structural mode, meaning the material power or the capacity to use so-called carrots and sticks to influence the behavior of others. If we then apply these modes to the Azerbaijani presidency, we know that Azerbaijan is not necessarily leading by example. Fossil fuels count for more than 90% of its total exports. In addition, Climate Action Tracker has classified its nationally determined contribution, their climate targets, as critically insufficient. And this critically insufficient means that if all parties would follow this level of ambition, we would be heading towards 4 degrees warming. During its presidency, Azerbaijan has promised part of this Troika presidency, so meaning the presidencies from last year, UAE, then this year Azerbaijan, and next year Brazil. So they've all promised to submit their NDCs, so these nationally determined contributions. They promised to submit 1.5 aligned NDCs, and Azerbaijan has even mentioned that they will do it early, before the technical deadline of February 2025. And this remains to be seen, but it does sound unlikely that they would be able to make such a radical shift in their climate policies, especially with this tight schedule. Then moving on to ideational, Azerbaijan is an authoritarian state, which already might make it more difficult for it to possess ideational leadership. One of its ideas before COP29 was this idea of a COP truce, meaning something similar to the Olympics truce. This was already before the conference considered a PR effort. And during the COP, it felt very contradicting that despite this COP truce effort, it was the presidency who often brought geopolitical tensions into the plenary hall. Perhaps still one outcome of this COP truce was that the nexus between climate and conflict, there was more attention to this topic at this COP. And just one example of this, bringing these geopolitics inside the plenary halls, is that Azerbaijan has had a decades-long conflict with its neighboring country, Armenia, and it almost felt that Azerbaijan made this conflict visible at the COP venue. The presidency also promoted a vision, enhance ambition, enable action. But during the COP, their visions on the finance target and the energy transition, which were the key themes of this COP, their visions on more precise wording of these themes remained unclear. Instead, the presidency used the platform to announce that they should not be called a petrostate and that their fossil fuels are a gift from God. The president also used this important platform for other matters, such as blaming France for overseas colonialism. This led to the French minister boycotting the conference and canceling their trip during the conference. Then moving on to instrumental leadership. Particularly during the second week of the negotiations, the presidency received plenty of criticism from parties feeling that they were not heard during the process. And inclusivity and transparency are really important in this process where some 200 nations are trying to reach consensus. The lack of instrumental leadership was also visible in the progress of the COP. Many negotiation tracks were deadlocked, and many of the items were postponed to be continued in future meetings. Then finally, about the structural leadership. If we think about how the Azerbaijani presidency could have shown structural leadership. During the COP, as it was a financial COP, Azerbaijan could have followed the example from last year's presidency, UAE, who during last year's conference, UAE committed a financial pledge to the Loss and Damage Fund. But despite of this example, Azerbaijan did not provide any financial contribution. Finally, perhaps some positive aspects after all this criticism for the presidency. I think it was clear how much effort Azerbaijan had placed on facilities and technical arrangements. I think it's seldom at COPs that you don't have to queue anywhere, and everything, including the logistics, worked extremely well. And then just a final point about the presidency, that even after mentioning this many weaknesses, I have to say, perhaps in support of the presidency, that after a weak outcome of the COP, I think it's rather easy to blame the president and for many parties to go behind the presidencies or the lack of leadership. While I still think it's important to remember that the presidency has power in the negotiations, but their power is still limited. So parties are still the ones negotiating, and it is still up to their level of ambition and implementation on how the tackling of climate crisis proceeds. Well, then something about the future of COPs. During these times, multilateralism seems difficult, considering the urgency of climate crisis. It does not help that during this COP, many parties felt that decisions were decided behind closed doors by a few powerful states or coalitions. This kind of minilateralism accusations are similar to 2009, when the Copenhagen Accord was perceived to have been negotiated by a handful of countries, including the US and basic countries, so Brazil, China, India, and South Africa. During the COP, there was also an open letter published by some high-level signatories, such as Ban Ki-moon and Christiana Figueres, the former executive secretary of the UNFCCC. And this letter was calling for a COP reform. It included, for instance, a call to streamline the speed and scale, also a call for improving accountability and setting stricter criteria for the presidency or the selection of the presidency. Well, there have been calls for reform throughout the history of UNFCCC, but it seems that there is growing frustration, which is getting clearer and clearer every year. I think this year is another good example of this debate of what consensus-based decision-making actually is. Can there still be objections from individual countries? For instance, India and Nigeria felt that their objections in the closing plenary were not heard. It's also clear that there are limitations to this bottom-up approach of the Paris Agreement. The more parties are talking about implementation, the more difficult it gets to overcome the fact that achieving these Paris Agreement targets relies on these nationally determined contributions, which are literally decided on the national level. Well then, luckily, fossil fuel lobbying is getting increasing attention from the civil society and researchers, but this attention has at least not yet been able to reduce the amount of fossil fuel lobbying at the COPs. And this year we saw yet another increase in the amount of these actors inside the COP venue. Despite all these frustrations and criticism, there were many parties emphasizing that at these times we need multilateralism more than ever. For instance, the G20 during their summit, which was organized at the same time with the COP, their joint statement included a strong commitment to multilateralism. Well, then moving on to the role of US. I think this was perhaps one of the most often heard questions at the COP. What is the influence of Trump's re-election? And I think it was really interesting to observe how there seemed to be a broad range of opinions on this. Some argued that the US was fully committed to reaching a final outcome, while some perceived that the last push was missing. On a more general level, I think this influence should not be downplayed. I think we cannot deny the potential influence that Trump's re-election had, for instance, on the strong rejection of fossil fuel-dependent countries at this COP who opposed any inclusion of fossil fuel language. The US delegation and their new climate envoy, John Podesta, they used a lot of space emphasizing their commitment to 1.5 degrees aligned development. They've, for example, even mentioned that the Biden administration is trying to prepare a new NDC, nationally determined contribution, which would include subnational action. There was also an announcement by the Biden administration during this COP that the US has surpassed its goal of providing $11 billion per year in international climate financing. John Podesta also explained that before January, they will work hard to prepare for the Trump administration, trying to Trump-proof some of their climate policies. Podesta also attempted to provide hope by emphasizing, for example, the We Are Still In movement, which was active also during Trump's last term. He also underlined the role of private sector and the ongoing energy transition, but also placed a great emphasis on the subnational climate action. One of his statements was that this fight is bigger than one election, one political cycle, and one country. Well, then moving on to China. China had fifth largest delegation at the COP and a very active pavilion with a full schedule of events. And I think similar to last time when Trump got elected, this increased expectations for China. The Executive Secretary Simon Steele, for instance, stated during the COP that we will need China's continued leadership. Last time when Trump got elected, China announced in 2017 that they will take a driver's seat in global climate governance. And at this COP, the Chinese officials explained that they are worried about the US climate politics and are willing to take a more active role. And I know that Julia will talk more about the finance goal, but during this COP, we also saw the first time that China was referring to its overseas aid as climate finance. Then Chinese officials, they also confirmed that China's next NDC will be economy-wide and cover all greenhouse gases. This confirmation was already announced last year in the Sunnyland Statement, which was written together with the US. But despite these claims of leadership and confirmations, there's still a lot of uncertainty about how ambitious China's next NDC is. During the COP, Carbon Brief released this analysis that China has now emitted historically more than EU, although it's still behind the US. And this NDC for China will be the first time that they're setting a target for the era when China's emissions are supposed to have peaked. Then just a few words about the US-China relations. It's well recognized in the climate leadership literature that success at COPs has often required the US and China to find a common ground on the negotiated outcome. Their bilateral relationship during the Biden administration has not been easy, but climate has been one of the important sectors where they have been able to find at least some common ground. Like I mentioned, they announced this Sunnyland Statement in 2023. This year, they've had meetings of the US-China Working Group, one in May and one in September. But these press releases after these meetings, they did not include any new language on fossil fuels, and they didn't include any specific wording for the finance target. These two countries, they both had new climate envoys this year, John Podesta and Liu Chenmin, which can be described as a significant change since the old envoys John Kerry and Xi Zhenhua had such a good personal relationship. And these new envoys, they organized the methane summit at COP29. As the US-China relations have not been so easy, this common ground in climate governance has taken a lot of effort. For instance, in Glasgow in 2021, the climate envoys were said to have met 21 times before they announced their joint statement. Therefore, it feels like this carefully constructed collaboration is losing its momentum after Trump's re-election. There were some optimistic views at the COP that methane could be considered a neutral enough topic where these two countries could collaborate during the Trump administration. But I think on a high level, that will also be extremely difficult, if not impossible. The envoys still announced that they're planning to organize a subnational climate event next year. Then moving on to the outcomes of the COP. Well, as I've already mentioned, this COP was clearly the finance COP. However, there were many parties also hoping to achieve ambitious decisions on mitigation and fossil fuels. Last year, COP28, it concluded the first global stocktake, meaning that the parties and the UNFCCC Secretariat, they were tracking the progress that the parties have made towards the Paris Agreement goals. However, Paris Agreement, even though it has this global stocktake mechanism there, it doesn't have any precise language on how to proceed or implement the stocktake outcomes. And this has proven a surprisingly difficult question, especially during this year. The preliminary idea was that these stocktake outcomes would inform the next round of NDCs that are due next year, but this has not been an easy task. So this was one of the key issues during the first days of the COP. Parties could not agree on what should be on the COP's official agenda. Related to this stocktake outcomes, they could not agree on where and whether to discuss these outcomes, whether the stocktake outcomes should only focus on finance or whether all stocktake outcomes, including the phrase on transitioning away from fossil fuels, whether these topics should be discussed as well. This so-called agenda fight was solved quite UNFCCC style with a footnote, but then in the end, this fight continued throughout the 2 weeks of negotiations. Well, one possibility to address these stocktake outcomes was the mitigation work program. This MVP was established at COP26 to scale up ambition, but it has had a limited progress since then. Parties disagreed on whether the work program has a mandate to send high-level political messages, and also how the stocktake outcome and the NDCs should be addressed in this program. During the second week, it felt that all parties were unhappy with the progress of the MVP, so the mitigation work program. The Arab group and like-minded developing countries, including, for instance, China, they were unhappy about the inclusion of stocktake and NDCs, and developed countries were unhappy for the lack of ambition, and they were demanding that these stocktake and NDCs should be included in the text. In the end, a draft decision was adopted without any mention of the stocktake outcomes or fossil fuels, with the decision to continue discussions. Then finally, another option for addressing the stocktake outcomes was the United Arab Emirates, so the UAE dialogue, which was established last year, particularly for this purpose. The debates and division lines between the parties were similar to the mitigation work program. In the end, the text did not include any strong wording on the stocktake and fossil fuels, and in the closing plenary, the draft decision was not adopted. Many parties thought that the text lacked ambition, and while this is perhaps good news that the text was rejected due to lack of ambition and not due to excessive ambition, this outcome is clearly disappointing for the next round of NDCs. So now it is, although the last year's stocktake text, of course, still is there and is guiding parties, but still it will be quite uncertain how this stocktake will then inform the parties, how they will address transitioning away from fossil fuels in their NDCs. However, at the same time, I think there was strong support for more ambitious language on these. And I think it's also a good test for those parties who are strongly arguing for the phasing out of fossil fuels, if and how these arguments are then visible in their NDCs. I'm afraid that many parties are advocating this phase out at the COP plenary halls, but then are unwilling to include stricter targets in their NDCs. And it is the NDCs and their implementation where strengthening of the climate action should happen. Thanks. I think I will leave rest to Julia, and I hope I didn't take too much time.
Thanks, Karoliina. Not at all. Thank you for those insights. It was very, very interesting, and we appreciate that you took the time also to discuss the presidency, as it has been established that the presidency in the UNFCCC process is very important. It's chosen regionally with a consensus, and that is now also shown its problematic side in the last couple of rounds, and that's one of the discussions that will probably keep going. Also, thanks for highlighting the importance of the NDCs and the kind of the lack of guidance that we're now witnessing with the second round, as well as we did in the first round in the Warsaw COP, was also unable to give that sort of guidance. So we kind of know where we are. Not going further to the substance matters, but inviting Julia to give her presentation. Julia is a very experienced UN climate negotiations hand. She has been involved in the process since 2007. I remember very fondly working with Julia in the COP18 in Doha. She's the associate professor of environmental law in the University of Eastern Finland and working at the Center for Climate Change, Energy and Environmental Law. The floor is yours, Julia.
Thank you, Anto, for this kind of introduction, and good morning, everyone. Can you see my presentation now? Yes? Okay. So thank you for choosing to spend this morning with us. Let me just set things up a little bit here. So indeed, I'm going to delve a little bit into the substance of this COP. As you know, this last COP, COP29, was labeled as a finance COP, and finance, of course, is a very important issue. It's a cross-cutting issue for climate negotiations. It's hugely important for the implementation of the Paris Agreement, especially in developing countries. But it's also an area of negotiations where developed and developing countries hold dramatically different views. So the reason why this, no, I'm not able to change for some reason. Let me. Okay. Is it okay? The slides are changing? Yes, okay. So the reason why this COP was labeled as a finance COP was that it was mandated to decide on a so-called new collective quantified goal, NCQG. This process loves acronyms, but I'll just refer to this as a new climate finance goal. And the background to this is the following. The background to this is that under the convention, countries, developed countries, agreed to provide financial resources to developing countries for climate change mitigation and adaptation based on the notion of their historical responsibility for climate change. Of course, the convention was negotiated in 1992. At the time, the group of developed countries included in Annex 2, so this is donor countries, was based on OECD membership of 1992. So you can see here on the map, it only included North America's, Western European countries, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. Of course, many things have changed since 1992, and these countries have been advocating for the expansion of this donor pool, so claiming that other countries should also contribute financial resources based on the changing structure of the global economy, based on the changing emission profiles of especially large developing countries like China, their per capita income, etc. Under the Paris Agreement, developed countries still hold an obligation to provide climate finance, but there is also a small provision where developing countries are encouraged to provide or continue to provide such support. So they don't have an obligation, but they're just encouraged to provide. So this is the background on the obligation of developed countries to provide climate finance. Coming to back to this a new goal in Copenhagen in 2009, developed countries agreed to jointly mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020 for developing countries, and this goal was met only 2022. This goal was reaffirmed in Paris in 2015. But in Paris, countries also agreed that prior to 2025, they would set a new climate finance goal. And this is the mandate behind this COP29. This is why this summit had to decide on this new climate finance goal. This new goal would be from the floor of 100 billion. And it would also take into account the needs and priorities of developing countries, because the previous one didn't have that clause. So what are the needs of developing countries? This is a very interesting question. The difficulty was changing. Yes. So we don't have to look in, to the whole of this picture. We'll only look in the middle of it, which compares different estimates of the needs of developing countries for climate finance. Well, first of all, it's relevant to understand here that there is no agreed definition of climate finance. So various actors, they actually mean different things by climate finance. And this, of course, reflects on the efforts to report and track climate finance floors. But nevertheless, there are several estimates from, let's say, reputable sources. And you can see here in the middle, that they vary from 500 billion a year to more than 2 trillion a year, the needs. It's also relevant here to look at what are the current flows. Well, these are not current, they're for 2022, but nevertheless, you can see the current flows are here, and you can see the needs are the gap is huge between what is provided and what is needed. Another, of course, relevant question is who should provide climate finance, right? And it's a question of fair shares. And many think tanks and many actors have engaged in conducting various analysis on this question, concluding that there is no simple answer to this question. The reason is that you can take into account various considerations. You can take into account historical cumulative emissions. Carolina mentioned that China's historical cumulative emissions have now surpassed EU's emissions, right? But you can also take into account metrics like per capita emissions, per capita income, maybe even climate vulnerability and various other metrics. So estimates based only on one parameter, they always give you skewed results. At the same time, any estimate would have to make several technical and political assumptions, and each of them can be contested. Nevertheless, this one analysis by the World Resources Institute, which is a think tank headquartered in the US, conducted several analyses, and based on the combination of emissions and economic metrics, they conclude that any estimate taking into account these metrics would assign the greatest responsibility for climate finance to the United States of America. So you can see here this illustrative scenario where US is really far ahead, and you have like China quite a distant second, and then you have other countries. Of course, China is often mentioned in the context of the expansion of the donor pool under the Climate Change Convention. Here, it's important to understand that China, of course, already provides quite a bit of finance relevant for climate goals, right? So we know that China gives a lot of financing for various clean energy projects in Africa, in Asia, through so-called South-South cooperation. And indeed, until recently, as Caroline also mentioned, China was reluctant to label it as climate finance. But COP29 was the first time when they actually openly admitted that they provide climate finance to developing countries, which indicates their willingness to engage on this topic, not necessarily as assuming an obligation, but to engage in this discussion. And again, there are various estimates of what this climate finance provided by China involves. Again, WRI estimates that in this decade, starting from 2013, China annually provided already 4.5 billion a year, which is for this decade equals to 6% of the total of what developed countries provide. And this places China already at the 5th place after Japan, Germany, United States, France, and on par with United Kingdom as a climate finance provider. One important caveat here that China is not a developed country, it doesn't have to report its climate finance, right? Which means that its data on climate finance is very opaque, it's very non-transparent, and it's very difficult to conduct any kind of comprehensive and comparison with other countries. So this is really like a crude estimate. So with this background, which I thought was important to reflect on, let's come back to negotiations. So COP29 had to decide on this new climate finance goal. And these discussions, of course, didn't begin at the COP. They actually began 3 years ago under this dedicated ad hoc working group. And this ad hoc working group organized various technical expert dialogues, various meetings. But it was very clear that the discussions were political and there was no substantive progress. Nevertheless, the co-chairs of this working group, they came up with some text, which was, I think, more than 30 pages. The text was rejected by parties at the start of COP29, so another text was developed, which was again discussed by parties during the first week of the COP, during the so-called technical phase, and then during the second week, but there was no substantive progress. It was a political discussion. And basically, the discussions were about 3 issues. The first issue, they're all interconnected. The first issue related to the quantum. So how much, what is the numerical target? The second question related to the contributors base. Who should provide the money? And the third question related to the structure of the goal. So I'll reflect on these 3 parts one by one. So the quantum, which has to do with how much money, here, developing countries which negotiate in the climate change negotiations as one, as a negotiating group of G77 in China. These are not 78 countries, these are actually 170-something countries, so it's basically the global south. They came with a clear demand. They, from the very beginning, they wanted to have developed countries providing 1.3 trillion US dollars a year by 2035. They also wanted to have clear numerical sub-goals for adaptation financing and for loss and damage financing. In addition, the most vulnerable countries, such as SEEDs, the small island developing states, and the least developed countries, they wanted to have clear allocations for their needs as well. In contrast, donor countries or developed countries, they didn't provide any numbers until the very last day. And their reasoning was that they did not want to engage in any discussion of the numbers until there is a discussion of extending the contributors base. Of course, this was completely opposed by developing countries, and this is not a position of just one country, like for instance China or the Gulf states. It's a common position shared by developing countries. They consider any extension of the contributors base as a renegotiation of the previous provisions of the convention and the Paris Agreement. There is quite a bit of fear on the part of countries like, for instance, India and others, that if China assumes an obligation to provide climate finance now, who will be next? So this discussion basically didn't proceed anywhere for the entire 2 weeks. So there's also a question of the structure, and this relates to the sources of this financing to be provided by developed countries, public or private sources. Here, there is an important distinction between provision and mobilization in the context of UN climate negotiations. Provision relates to the provision of the public money, whereas mobilization concerns mobilization of the private money, but through public interventions. So it's still connected to public money. So what developing countries wanted, they wanted to have two goals for the public money and for private money, for private financing. Developed countries, on the other hand, they wanted also two goals, but one goal would be provision plus mobilization without specifying the proportions. And then the other goal would be a so-called investment goal, which would concern all sources, all external and domestic finance, etc. So basically everything. And there are also other questions here important for especially developing countries is a question of grants versus loans. So in what form of financing is provided, questions of access to financing, etc. So these were kind of broad areas of disagreement. And as you know, perhaps countries adopted a decision on a new goal after the 2 days and 2 nights, starting I think from Friday of negotiations. Those were very difficult at some point. The most vulnerable countries, the negotiating groups of most vulnerable countries, even walked out of consultations. Then on Sunday night, the decision on a new climate finance goal was adopted. It was somehow like stage managed by, as someone described it, by the co-presidency, because there was actually countries which opposed this new goal, like India, Nigeria, etc. But nevertheless, the decision was adopted. And what does this decision say? It does suggest 2 goals. So one goal, which kind of seems to be broadly related to that suggestion for an investment goal. So it concerns this invitation to all actors to enable the scaling up of financing for developing countries from all sources to at least 1.3 trillion per year. And then there is a goal in extension of the previous 100 billion, which is at least 300 billion per year by 2035, where developed countries take the lead. This goal also would come from a wide variety of sources, so public and private. But there is also a new language, somewhat cryptic language, which has this recognizing the voluntary intention of parties to count their climate finance towards this goal. And it seems this language accommodates countries like China, who on a voluntary basis can count their finance towards this goal. So, which means that basically this goal is not only to be met by developed countries, but developing countries can also contribute to it. And beyond this goal, developing countries in general are encouraged, again, to make contributions on a voluntary basis. So in essence, there are no sub-goals for adaptation or loss and damage. There are no specific allocation floors for the most vulnerable countries. What developing countries did get, though, they got some kind of a language on increasing flows through multilateral climate funds. So there's this multilateral climate funds like the Green Climate Fund, Adaptation Fund, Loss and Damage Fund, and these are generally preferred by developing countries because they have a say in their governance. So it seems that the kind of climate finance flows have to triple increase, so that the outflows from these funds have to triple according to this decision. There is some soft language also on improved access to financing, on the preference for grants and concessional financing. And how is progress going to be monitored? The Standing Committee on Finance, which is one of the mandated bodies under the convention, would report on a collective progress every 2 years. And also at the last minute, there was this insertion of the so-called Baku to Billion roadmap, which is supposed to produce a report on how this broader investment goal of 1.3 trillion is going to be achieved. So this is on the finance goal. There was also a question of carbon markets. It's a separate negotiating track. I think it's important to reflect on it as well, because this is one area where COP29 actually achieved some success. This has to do with Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. This article have been in the work. The operationalization of that article has been in the work for 9 years. And these discussions are both very technical, but also very political. So the remaining parts of this rule book for international carbon markets were finalized at COP29. And this had to do with 2 articles of this, especially with 2 articles of this Article 6, Article 6.2, which is a party-to-party carbon trading, so where countries engaged in various discussions on the authorization of carbon credits, on registries, etc., and the transfer. And then 6.4, this article has to do with a Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, which is basically a successor to the clean development mechanism, if you remember such a mechanism from the times of the Kyoto Protocol. So here, what happened is that prior to the meeting to COP29, the subsidiary body adopted a set of decisions which in the manner which was well criticized by some countries in terms of transparency and lack of inclusiveness, but nevertheless COP29 accepted those decisions, and those decisions concerned this so-called sustainable development tool, which is has to do with environmental and social safeguards, and also 2 sets of methodologies on carbon removals and on the number of carbon units that projects can generate. So, and also in addition, parties also engaged in other discussions relating to this, to operationalizing this crediting mechanism. So this sets of rules were adopted at COP29. And I wanted to end with a bit of a kind of reflection on what's going to happen next in the UN climate negotiations. As Carolina mentioned, next year is very important because countries are supposed to submit their new national climate plans called Nationally Determined Contributions, NDCs. They have to technically submit them by February, but in practice, they will probably be submitting them throughout the year. And of course, the most important question for those national climate plans is their mitigation ambition, overall mitigation ambition. And do they bring us any closer to achieving the 1.5 degree temperature target or not? Countries will also engage in further discussions at intersessional meetings in June in Bonn. And the next COP30 will take place in Belém in Brazil. And of course, the central discussion will be on mitigation based on those NDCs that should be submitted by then. And in addition, also the COP presidency, Brazilian COP presidency indicated they would like to put nature in the center of discussions and build some linkages with possibly with biodiversity negotiations. So this is all from my side. I would be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Julia, for these valuable insights and the key breakdown of the financing negotiations. We can now take a couple of questions from the audience as well. You can write them in the chat. We have a little bit of time, but in the meantime, I'll use my chair's privilege to further interrogate these two presentations for a little bit. It seems to me that now the broadening of the donor base, as Julia explained, is a very political question that goes into the structure of the climate negotiations, who have for their history been very much aligned with North against South, which is now more complex than it used to be. But broadening the donor base is a very, very difficult political question, and the text indeed is open to a lot of interpretation now. Of course, the developed countries now say that it has been broadened, while developing countries can even say that we didn't even approve of the text, as we objected to it a little bit in the final plenary. So how do you see this fragile consensus? What's your interpretation? Will we be returning it to in the future COPs a lot, or can we, let's say, work on it on a consensual manner? Maybe Julia first, and then Karolina.
Yes, sure, Anto. Thank you for this question. Of course, as you know, it's always every COP decision is some kind of compromise, right? Especially on the most political questions, and it also reflects some degree of ambiguity. Sometimes this ambiguity is constructive, sometimes it's perhaps less constructive. And indeed, the language of this decision, as usual, it's not an exception. It's quite cryptic and can be interpreted in many different ways. And I think we'll continue to see this discussion, of course, resurfacing again and again, especially given the very strong objections of India in the final plenary.
Interesting, and it also kind of touches upon the limits of consensus, or what is a consensus. So was India's objection sustained objection, as the lawyers would have it, or not? Interesting question. What's your interpretation, Karolina?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think this is an excellent example of how something that was already quite ambiguous before with the climate finance can become even more complex and more ambiguous. I think you can already see how parties are interpreting the results differently. For example, the presidency announced this post that mentioned this 300 billion target, referring it to as finance from developed to developing. So this whole term of developed taking the lead, which has been often used in the UNFCCC context, there is, of course, a great level of ambiguity there. And after the conference or during the last days of COP, I heard a Chinese official saying that developed countries' financial obligations must be further clarified. So I think it's safe to say that this is a topic that will be negotiated or discussed further in the future.
Yeah, I tend to agree with your notions. Not everything was solved in one COP. There's a lot of pressure, of course, on China because it's a global great power and second largest economy of the world. But there are also other, of course, countries that could be expected to chip in, such as the rich countries in the south. United Arab Emirates has been mentioned, and then the new OECD members like Korea and Chile and so forth. Moving on, another very interesting Baku event was what Carolina touched upon, was this growing frustration in the slow multilateral process and what some newspapers refer to commonly as the COP circus of each year, and the open letter by very prominent UN people, including former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, calling for a reform. What are your thoughts on this? And let me specify, what kind of reform would you see as possible, or do you see all kinds of reforms that would require consensus or semi-consensus of 200 states, a waste of time? Do you think we can reform the UNFCCC process? And if so, what would be on your wish list? Carolina, can you take the first cut on this question?
Yeah, thank you for this really easy question, especially with the additional what is possible. I could come up with a number of solutions that I don't think are possible or easy. I think we also have to have more discussion about the limitations of the COPs. I think every year the expectations for COPs just keep growing, and I'm not sure if it's always clear for the public what are actually the level of ambition or agreement that is possible to be achieved at the COP. So I think it's important to focus more on the implementation. It's not only sufficient that the ambition is in the NDCs, because that could lead then to prolonging the action to, for example, to 2050, which we know it's not possible that everyone will keep emitting until 2050. So I think it's important to discuss not only the ambition, but the implementation of NDCs. And I think also there has been perhaps too little awareness and discussion on the sort of the weak accountability mechanisms in the UNFCCC. I think it's really important to discuss also the fact that what happens if an NDC is not achieved, if the targets are not achieved. But perhaps those are not like radical reforms, but I just think that, for example, changing the voting rules will be very difficult in this current geopolitical situation.
Thanks. So what's on your top of your list, Julia, and what is possible?
Well, first of all, I think I wanted to also touch upon this question, which Carolina also mentioned, the rising expectations for COPs, what COPs can achieve, what they cannot achieve. It's good to remember here, I'm giving a legal perspective, that COPs are governing bodies of international treaties. So it's a question of whether we believe in those treaties, whether we believe in multilateral responses as potential responses to global problems, or we do not believe those. And of course, multilateralism in general is under pressure at the moment, right, in this era. So this is one perspective. Another perspective, more concretely on ways to improve this process. I think it is possible to improve, to streamline some of the processes here. I agree with Carolina. I think voting probably wouldn't, changing voting rules, this wouldn't be possible. I also don't know to what extent this would actually generate legitimate outcomes if there would be, for instance, countries which would vote against some decisions. But there were actually in the letter which was mentioned, in the letter there were some suggestions, practical suggestions, which I found interesting. For instance, establishing a dedicated science advisory body within the process. So this would be something, it would be objected definitely, but it's just something interesting to explore.
Karolina, please.
Yeah, just one thing that I want to add on this, that I think it's becoming so common to criticize the COPs, and with this frustration, that I think it's also important to discuss the challenges of what are the other options then. For example, if you think about this minilateralism accusations, I think it's really important to recognize the UNFCCC as a platform where the small island developing states and least developed states, they have a role there and they have a voice there, and they, for example, with this finance target, they had a role there during those last days. So I think it's really important to also understand what are the challenges for these countries who have been waiting for the finance and who have been waiting for the action coming from developed countries for 30 years now. So if we now say that this process is no longer possible, then how does it look from the perspective of these countries?
Thank you. It's a good point. We can also argue that perhaps the recognition of a 1.5 degrees goal or the view to 1.5 degrees is influenced by the small developing states, which we wouldn't have in the G7 or even G20 settings, of course. There's a question about carbon markets, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot because there's a certain breed of climate people who are very into carbon markets and know all the technicalities, and I have a hunch that neither of us three belong to that special group of people. However, we could, Julia touched upon it briefly and gave us kind of the background why it was so hard. It took 9 years to operationalize the provisions of the Paris Agreement on this issue. But just in a very common sense, what is your kind of gut feeling as UNFCCC experts and climate experts? Are we safe now concerning the carbon markets? Are the rules that have been agreed now, do they keep us safe from, let's say, double accounting or additionality problems or junk credits or these kind of issues? Can we trust them now? Can you, Julia, perhaps take a swing first at this question?
Yes, sure. Of course, this kind of with carbon markets, there's this kind of area of issues which are always discussed, as you already mentioned. There's a lot of fear that carbon markets in general, they would undermine mitigation actions, right, in high emitting countries. There's question of additionality. There's question of integrity of these carbon credits and what kind of carbon projects are, what kind of projects these are, because there have been some accusations, for instance, of some countries funding fossil fuel projects as carbon reduction projects. So, and double counting, as you mentioned. What I'm hearing from various experts is that it will, of course, still take some time to develop various methodologies as well, and this is important in the context of the rule book for carbon markets. So for the screening mechanism, for instance, some methodologies haven't been developed yet. They will be developed. The mandate has been given to the supervisory body to continue work on methodologies, and I think the indication is that this will be this work will be conducted next year, and this will give some detail to this still generic rules that were adopted.
Karolina, what's your take?
Yes, I don't know if I have that much to add. I was actually at COP. I heard some of the technical negotiators, they even who were negotiating this topic, they even said that it has become so technical that it's hard to follow the topic. I think there were high hopes that this result could end up reducing greenwashing, but I think this is also a matter that we're that nobody actually knows how this will actually influence. And coming back to my point earlier about the implementation, that no matter what are the rules that are adopted, if the implementation doesn't work, then there will be, of course, there will be challenges to see this as an effective measure.
Yeah, I think a lot of the skepticism that people have on new mechanisms and carbon market is based on the old experience of Clean Development Project, CDM. Let's say the first cut of carbon market experiences internationally with the Kyoto Protocol wasn't that successful. So, but perhaps some of the pitfalls can be avoided. There is a comment by a prominent expert, Eugenia, also highlighting the concerns over the carbon markets, and I guess has been already some political interest being expressed to use these kind of mechanisms, for example, by Japan. So we will keep following this discussion, of course, see how it goes forward. There's also has been oh, sorry, Julia, you have the floor if there was an additional remark.
No, it wasn't an addition, but I just wanted to maybe answer some questions on finance in the chat. If that's the right moment.
Please go ahead, and I will also just if you can also talk a little bit about the so-called innovative new sources that have been there have been some hopes pinned on some new mechanisms on levies, international fees of some sort. Can we get some finance from there?
Yes, there was some discussion on this, on innovative and alternative sources of financing. This Baku to Billion roadmap is, by the way, to 1.3 might also reflect on those, what they actually mean. There is some language in the text, generic language, but it's good to remember that this forum is not the right one to decide on those matters. It doesn't have jurisdiction over those issues. So for aviation levy, this would be ICAO, and then for shipping levies, this would be IMO, etc. So there was a question I wanted just to respond on the first question. Thank you for that. How does this goal meet the needs? Well, it doesn't meet the needs, as I showed you on my slides. The obstacles to increasing financial commitments are very clear. Many countries, donor countries, cite fiscal problems at home, budgetary cuts, and a lot of in many countries, development aid budgets have been cut. Besides, of course, with the US possibly departing the Paris Agreement, but regardless whether they depart or not, they will probably not honor their financial commitments, and it's a very big donor on the international scale. And then there was a question on the loss and damage fund. The loss and damage fund. Since Dubai, there was kind of discussion on the role of the World Bank and the host whereas the secretariat would be hosted. So this was decided. Also, who would be the director of the secretariat. This was also decided and confirmed by the COP. But the most important part for the loss and damage fund for this COP29 was, of course, a possible sub-goal for loss and damage financing, and this was rejected. It was very clear that it was not possible to agree on.
Thank you, Julia, for those remarks. We're running out of time. I have one final question that's looking forward to the Belém COP and the new host country, the new president, incoming presidency of Brazil. Perhaps you can, Karolina, take a first answer or cut. There are lots of hopes now pinned on Brazil, and you mentioned that a bad UNFCCC presidency and which has only moderate capacity or not good leadership can be used as a scapegoat as well, that we can't do things because the presidency is bad. I think it's one of those issues where both are true, that presidency is important and can be an obstacle, and that obstacle can also be used cynically. Next up, we have Brazil. There's a lot of diplomatic capacity in Brazil. It has a history of being a very active country in the climate negotiations since the Rio and the negotiations leading up to Rio Convention in '92. So what can we expect from Brazil now? It's also a basic country. It's a BRICS country. It tends to hold the negotiations in a very peripheral area of Belém. How do you see this playing out? Will Brazil show leadership in different forms, Carolina?
Yes, this is really interesting because having these two presidencies, Azerbaijan and then Brazil, they're of course really different countries. If you look at from the climate diplomacy perspective, Azerbaijan was rather unknown country in the climate negotiations before this year. Brazil then, of course, has a different diplomatic capability. It is known for these big summits, environmental summits. They've been also really eager to host this COP30 because they have this history of organizing these what's it called? Tasaluku, Antto. Like even figure COPs. Sorry. And I think Brazil also played an important role this year to support the Azerbaijani presidency, the latest developed country presidency, UK, and the upcoming developing country presidency, Brazil. They were selected to support the negotiation process in Azerbaijan. And I think people are having high hopes for the Brazilian presidency. I think they've been already collaborating with UAE and Azerbaijan as part of this troika, combining the three presidencies. And they've been trying to show this leadership by example by advocating this 1.5 Celsius aligned NDCs. But there are some current concerns about especially the fossil fuel, how committed Brazil actually is to phasing out fossil fuels. So I'm still kind of deciding my stance, but I think we should not rely too much on the ambition of the Brazilian presidency either. We know that next year will be a difficult COP as well, with Trump being in the White House, for example.
Thank you. Julia, what's your gut feeling on Brazil?
Well, first of all, I agree with Carolina. It's a very, in terms of COP presidencies, it's a very strong COP presidency, right? But at the same time, it's a question about the role of COP presidencies, what they can actually do, and to what extent they can orchestrate success at COPs. Because as the next year indeed is a very difficult one in many respects. It's a crucial year. Countries will be submitting their new NDCs. And now the developing countries are very disappointed with the result of discussions on a new climate finance goal. I think this will reflect very negatively on the ambition of their NDCs. For instance, we have to look for countries like India. Of course, in the context of this kind of insufficient mitigation ambition on the global scale, let's see how much the Brazilian COP presidency can do in order to achieve some kind of a success at the next COP.
Exactly, it's not an all some kind of all superpower in that sense that it could twist the arms of great powers to do more for climate. That's another thing that we'll be following in the forthcoming climate briefings. Finally, there's also a mention in the chat about Brazilian presidency and how things played out in the biodiversity negotiations, where Brazil was pushing hard for new fund and was not perhaps could be interpreted not as a bridge builder, but as a more of a hardliner, one could even say. But that's of course different with the presidency, presidential role and so forth. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Carolina, for these insights. There are lots of questions to address and lots of readings to do and interpretations to come. But we're a bit more wise now than we were 1.5 hours ago. Thank you so much for everybody attending the FIIA climate briefing, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.